Hello, and this is Conversations from the Alcove from the Lucille Lortel Theater. The Alcove is the new play development program here at the Lortel. My name is Caridad Svich. I am a playwright. I'm also the artistic director of the new play program here. And if you've been following this series in your odd days on the internet, here on the YouTube channel for the Lortel, these conversations are with playwrights and the main theater makers on arts and ideas. Some of it about the craft of playwriting, a lot of it about people's own practice and work. So welcome if you're new to this series or if you're joining us from other conversations. I am beaming in from the land of Lenape, which is now also known as New York City. I will describe myself briefly. I am a fair-skinned person with sort of brownish, blondish streaks of hair. I have bangs that are kind of fluffy, and I have my hairstyle is that I have a kind of like a sort of ponytail on one side. I have tortoiseshell glasses that are brown, that are sitting on the edge of my nose, and red lipstick. My background is white. You might see a little light kind of shining in a corner. I'm wearing a blue top that has, you won't see it very clearly, maybe you will in this image, sun, moon, and stars is the print on this blue top. So the constellations are with me. And I have headphones on that are white and they're sort of dangling from my ears. They're skinny headphones. They're not the bulky kind. Very, very brief description. Super brief description, but it gives you a lay of the land. My guest today is the wonderful Andy Bragen, an incredible, talented playwright and theater maker. I'm going to do a brief bio of Andy before I turn it over to Andy to introduce themselves formally. Andy Bragen, a graduate of the Brown University MFA program in literary arts, recipient of many awards, recipient of workspace, process space residencies from the Lower Manhattan Cultural Council, honors from New York Foundation of the Arts, Club Thumb Theater, Jerome Fellowship, has been a resident at the Berkeley Rep with their ground floor program, has also been a resident at the Malay Colony, the Blue Mountain Center, an alumnus of New Dramatists, has written many, many plays, many wonderful plays. Among them, This Is My Office, which was produced at Off-Broadway by the Play Company and received a Drama Desk nomination for Best Solo Performance. And Notes on My Mother's Decline, which premiered at New York Theater Workshop Next Door in 2019. Co-production between the Play Company again and Andy Bragen Theater Projects. Hello, Andy Bragen Theater Projects. Both of these plays, This Is My Office and Notes on My Mother's Decline, are published together by Northwestern University Press. Andy is also a translator. We can talk about that later in the conversation, and also holds a sustaining and ongoing collaboration with jazz saxophonist and composer John Ellis. Also teaches at many colleges all over and is a wonderful educator. So enough of bios, but I'm so happy they're here. Andy, introduce yourselves to us.
Well, first of all, thank you, Caridad, for having me and for the lovely introduction. I will do a visual audio description. I am fair-skinned, if a little bit ruddy, with metal glasses, brown hair with some flecks of gray. I have, the background is my living room with some shelving to, I guess, to my left, to the right when you're looking at the screen. And I'm wearing a red and black checkered shirt.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Andy. Thanks for introducing us. Are you also beaming in from the land of Lenape?
I am indeed, Lower Manhattan.
Very great. Awesome. So these conversations, I always start with the same question. I feel like it may be the only question that we'll have for the next 10 years if we get there as a planet, which is we're obviously living under and during a climate crisis. And I wonder how it's affecting your practice, the kind of work that you're making, the kind of work you're thinking about making, both on a practical level, but also on a conceptual and theoretical level.
Yeah, that's a really interesting and complicated question. I think I've been thinking about climate change in the various terms that it's they've been using it for about 20 years in various plays, going back to a play called Mother Earth that I wrote in 2007, a play I did at University of Rochester, The Hairy Dutchman, which imagines rising seas a little bit on a tennis court over by the East River, courts that right now are actually have been knocked down because a seawall is being built over there right now. I'm a lifelong resident I live across the street from where I grew up on 4th Street and Avenue A. So there's something about continuity where you're very aware of change. I think right now it affects me in a couple ways. Definitely it's in some of the writing I've been doing lately, some new plays called The Bottleneck, which deals with it theoretically, in a play called To the Playground, which is about adults on the playground and their obsessions, both, I'd say, banal and existential. But that question, and I think about it as the parent of a 9-year-old, what is the world that lies ahead in 30 years, and why aren't we in the streets, and why aren't we, really stopping everything? Because I think it's a valid question, and it's hard to know what to do with it. I mean, I think that in a more theoretical level, I think a little bit about Chekhov. It's made me think a lot about the past and the future in my writing, in the sense of Chekhov always talks about 100 years from now, where are we? What are we doing? And so I've tried to think about that, and that's a part of a longer conversation about what are our choices, what are our levels of complicity right now in the society we live in the world we live in, and what does that look like 100 years from now or 200 years from now? And the piece that Lortel has been kind enough to support is a piece about I'm engaging with some history from my mother's family that's from Mississippi, and I have enslaving ancestors, and I think a lot about where they're 150 to 200 years ago, and they made some choices as human beings that are, from our perspective, and I think from a lot of contemporary perspectives of theirs, deeply, deeply wrong. And yet those choices were made, and they went about their lives. So I think along with examining that on an ethical level, one must also think about oneself. And I guess to sort of continue on the subject, I think there's a lot of thinking about what does it mean to write works of fiction in this age, and how does that change? Do you know that book, The Great Derangement by Amitav Ghosh?
Yes, of course. Yes. I've referenced it in one of my plays. Yeah.
Well, good. I mean, it's a really fascinating piece of text, that idea that the novel arose in an area of climate stability, and we may be entering a moment that we're not in that. And how does that affect how we tell stories? How does it affect things mythically or otherwise? So I think these are really deep questions that we're all trying to reckon with in different ways as people, as writers, as thinkers, as children and parents. So it's hard to separate. I think in a way, maybe also the part of it that feels empowering and calming is to be engaged with it in a way, as opposed to this is the world we live in, and there are things that we need to improve immensely, but we are, this is the world, and the world has always had different kinds of uncertainty that often have been created by humans, not always, but a lot. And so we are part of that right now. That's a very long answer for you.
No, it's a wonderful answer. I guess I just want to pick up two strands in that answer that are related, but may branch off into something else. One of them has to do with the ethical imperative that is part of being a playwright, which sometimes doesn't get discussed very often. How do you face the page ethically? How do you stage things ethically? As playwrights, we are architects of a theater experience. So what are the ethics around that, and the ethics of care, which then reflect larger ethics of care related to the environment that we're in, that is deeply unethical in the way it's handling the planet, right, and each other as people, extractive and exploitative, and so on. And the other part of the strand that I want to pick up on is this notion of futurity, and I think one of the difficult things right now, I think for a lot of artists, is how do you dream of a future in work, right? Where it definitely feels like we're on the edge of extinction. So I think ethics and futurity, you can take either strand, you can play with those, toss them up in your mind. But yeah, I'm just wondering if there's anything that comes to you from either of these.
I think the ethics thing is both macro and micro and is interesting. I look at the way some people are making theater right now. Sandra Goldmark, who's really working for sustainable theater practices. And also I teach part-time at Barnard, and she is head of the, I think, I'm forgetting, it's called the sustainability sort of program there, or a program there. And she thinks very deeply about this. And I know she's on the board right now for Hudson Valley Shakespeare Company, and what Davis McCallum, which I've seen a video of it. They're rebuilding space, and they're doing it in a way that is everything they're doing. They're reusing costumes, the theater they're building. They're really thinking about what does this look like for the future in a really deep way. And they're really questioning and looking at every part of the system in terms of their practice, which I think is really on a kind of concrete level is really impressive. And there's a lot to be learned from that. And some theaters, I think, are starting to make that step and think about, well, what can we do concretely within our field? I also think that a lot of it comes down to on a community level and how people make things together. I think back to our mutual friend Jorge Ignacio Cortinez with his own company Fulcrum, and my wife was in 2 plays of that company. It was in Cortinez's play Bird in the Hand, and I think he made a sort of a real point of when they all walked in the room in terms of how they greeted each other, in terms of what that collective engagement was. So I think part of it is how do you proceed as an ethical citizen in the small things, because that's part of it, and that part of that process is essential. In terms of futurity, I go back and forth on this in a way. I'm perhaps am a little more sanguine than you are about this. I'm hopeful that we will all muddle through in some crazy way, and that we all will do our best, and that things are in some ways hopeless, and there's also great hope. So when you exist in a world of that kind of uncertainty and challenges, I don't think you ever, I think you still engage fully. For me, I engage fully with the future, and I hope and dream of good futures and better futures. And as a writer, I guess writing a play, and maybe you're pointing at this, that writing a play is an act of hope. And I don't always wake up in the morning with that hope on a sort of on a personal writing level. I don't know where this play has a home, or I don't know if the world is going to be a super hospitable place. And yet somehow there's something in it to engage in thought and in conversation and in community that engages me and keeps me going.
Yeah, I hear you. It's I think you are more sanguine than I am about this, but that's uh, I think that's useful, in the sense that in the field we need all folks on deck thinking in different ways about what does the future mean and how do we apprehend it, as well as looking at the present, which is one of our main tasks as artists. I wanted to shift gears a little bit, although this is related, to a recent strand, I would say, in your writing, that I know of anyway, which has to do with, it doesn't really have a label, but I've been thinking about it all morning, which is is it speculative documentary, verbatim documentary speculation, work like Notes on My Mother's Decline, This Is My Office, both, that deal with your family. Mosley, which is a play you're working on with us, which deals with, family history on your mother's side, which you mentioned briefly in your prior answer. And so where did the strand come from? Because it wasn't present that I know of in your earlier work. And so how has it been manifesting? And is this part of a new for you a new phase in your writing, or do you see it as a, you know how people make paintings, in a series? This series of paintings will be about X, and then I've completed that series and I move on. So I just wonder where this kind of work sits in your practice, and how you're building it, and what your larger investigation is.
I think that's a great question. And it's come up in different ways. I have always started indirectly with the personal, and perhaps as I've gotten older, I've gotten a little more direct and raw with that in some sense, especially after losing parents. There's something about that. I mean, this is my office. I didn't know I was setting out to write about my father. I was in this amazing space, Lower Manhattan Cultural Council workspace, and something about the atmosphere of that space brought about that haunting. And when I first started, he had died maybe 2 years before I started the play, a little bit more. So he was still with me and very much on my mind in a more active way than perhaps he is now, 16 years down the line. And that play arose from that, and I found it a really interesting and fruitful way to approach things. I felt like I was getting into some interesting questions, and I could find a theatrical way to engage with them. With the work about my mother, I think it came out. My mother, in some ways, was a more complicated and difficult figure for me in my life, I think. And it sort of naturally followed upon it. And again, it was sort of, there had been some thoughts. I think I remember writing down a little bit about each of her decades of her life, just to think about that, not knowing what it was being her journey from Mississippi to New York, a big accident she was in when she was very young, and how that kind of defined her. And I started that play when she was still alive, right after This Is My Office. I wrote a first draft very quickly, and as it was going on, I had written a lot of notes on my mother's decline as my mother was declining precipitously and getting worse and worse. But I couldn't actually write the end of it until after she passed away at the end of 2017, in a way. And I think that both of those plays helped me personally, and found like a way. I felt my specific story, which both was a mix of, as you said, there's some deep truths in it, and it also, the language led me forward. I think my mother had very vivid language, and she always had affected the language of my plays. As a Mississippian who lived most of her life in New York, I think I had a dinner party for some friends on my 35th birthday, and she was there. I think we all went to Kanji Village and got a room, and an actor friend of mine after said, "I know where the language in your plays comes from," because she was a fairly performative individual. And I guess I've followed it. I am writing other plays that don't fit that exactly in many ways, as we all do. We write many different things, and I want to be able to do a million things, but there's something about this strand that has been interesting. And I think Mississippi specifically, the first full-length play I ever wrote in my early 20s was a play called Formaldehyde, set in Mississippi in the 1950s, about a little girl whose father has died, and she wants to be a scientist, and at 12-year-old, she's trying to dig him up and trying to bring him back to life. And I wrote it in the wonderful late Tina Howe's class at Hunter, a graduate class. And it was a first play, but it was very alive, and it had for me at least, it had something. It captured something, and then I think I moved away from it. It felt, I think, the naturalism, the emotions, probably some part of me, and this is my own failure. It felt uncool in some way or something. Or writing about 1950s Mississippi, it didn't feel like who I was or who I wanted to be. And I feel like to return to this material, which was inspired by some documents and papers I found, and to write about it in a different way, and maybe I'll write about it in a few different ways, I think, because there's so much there, has been really gratifying, and kind of bringing some things back to me, and integrative in a way, as I'm such a New Yorker, and I felt that was not part of my life in a way, that southern part of my family. And I'm not it isn't exactly now, other than in a kind of literary sense, but there was something that was where my mother is. My mother's from a very unique and complicated and awful in some ways place. And that made her who she was. And she grew up in a really terrible way with an alcoholic father. And that is part of me in a way. And I'm glad to be we are this sort of combination of these ancestors, and to engage with that in different ways has been really fruitful for me. And I think, I don't know how long I stay with this, but I have been really interested in it.
Yeah, I hear you. I wonder if, for those people watching, and I know the play is evolving as we speak. So, but I think the process thus far, even with Mosley, from changing titles, from the form of it changing, et cetera, would be really instructive for people watching here today. And maybe if you're willing to divulge a little bit of like how, even in the time that you've been developing this piece, how it's shifted gears. If there's anything you want to speak to about the process behind it.
Sure. I mean, I guess I could talk about my first engagement with this material. I came across this will of an ancestor in 2017. I started doing some writing over the pandemic. I wrote a book-length memoir, which was dealing with a lot of this history, which was also dealing with that and my New York childhood. So that was one approach I had to it. I haven't really found a home for that, but it was really interesting. And I did a lot of research, and I wrote and rewrote a couple hundred pages. So that was my first engagement. Then I started writing a version of what might have been a play with monologues and photos. And I wrote a couple versions of that. And they weren't quite coming together. They weren't quite right. I wasn't sure what the story of my whiteness in relation to my ancestors, whether it was making sense theatrically, it was a story I wanted to tell. Meanwhile, I had also been to Mississippi once, and I went back again, and I did an amazing interview with two men who were descended from those enslaved by my family on a certain piece of land, and that interview was transcribed, and I have the recording, and so I had that, and I was thinking, well, how can I engage with that information? I got a little support from Barnard College, which allowed me to go down there again. I was kind enough to receive a Lortel mini commission, which helped support it, and at that point, I had written one other draft with photos of a totally different play than the first draft with photos. And I gave it to one or two friends, and I was looking at it. I read it out loud to a director, and it wasn't quite right, but it felt too illustrative in a way. So I said, let me go back to the drawing board again. And I started again from page 1, where the photos were in my mind, but they weren't literally used, and they were referred to in some sense. And I did a version like that. And then I kept sort of revising and trying to peel sense of judgment and telling myself I was a good liberal out of it and just letting the story tell itself. And I came in with a text that I thought was pretty solid to a workshop a couple weeks ago. And when we got in there, it felt what the most compelling material were some various primary documents I had, both this interview and some other documents I had tracked down related to family stuff, some pretty ugly family stuff, slave schedules, and sort of inventory lists of people and animals and tools, parts of a will, parts of a diary from my great-great-grandfather coming back from Gettysburg. And so what we ended up doing in that week-long workshop is we took a lot of these materials, and we also, I think there's a little bit of text from me. There had been a lot of text, and now there's a monologue, I think, but very little is explained. And I found a new form of the play, which I'm excited about. But I think and also, I guess I should say that I've also been working on off and on another play related to some of that material, and trying something much more sort of for characters and seeing what that is. So I'm trying. I mean, it's both. It's a strange process. I mean, all processes are all ultimately unique, and this one has been just the volume of different tactics and the distance between them has been interesting and unique and exciting, and I think has been continuing to slowly move towards something that I feel hopefully is compelling.
Cool. That's awesome. And certainly, I know that sometimes people think, I think, oh my gosh, I'm thinking about how when people encounter plays, if they do at all, it's, maybe in a class in English, in high school or something, the Crucible usually, and it's in print. And there is often this illusion that it just came fully formed from the writer's mind, and what you see in print is the thing, right? And so I think that, um, understanding that there are many different ways that plays happen, that they get made, that they get thought about, that they get reconceptualized along the way, is really useful for folks. And also a good reminder for practitioners to go like, yes, you can try it different ways while you're working on it, and it's okay to do that. I wanted to, again, shift gears just a little bit to maybe look at your work as a translator, which is a life as an artist. And I think that, I would say that translation gets very short shrift in the US in terms of recognition, especially in theater, recognition that it is an art form, that you are a writer when you're a translator, that it's not this sort of sometimes I think it's treated like dictation or something. Like it's
Mhm.
just a very strange, like mechanical process. And I just wonder about your various experiences as a translator and how that's both how you've engaged in those experiences, but also, and maybe you can highlight one or two, but also how that's affected your own practice as a playwright.
Yeah, I mean, I feel very, very lucky to have done some translations. I spoke French and did a little bit of French early on. I did a Coltez play for a Coltez festival, and I didn't know Coltez's work. So I think what I love so much about translation, I haven't done as much lately, but what I love about it is being able to enter into the rhythms of another writer. It's a small time to be inside their brain and to find, your own language within it, but to sort of, you get a little bit of a sense, writing is thinking, and to see how someone else writes is a way into how they might think. So that's one part of it that I've really loved. So I did a little bit of work in French. This is about 20 years ago. And then through the Playwrights Center, I was on as a sort of a co-translator adapter of a couple Japanese plays, including one called Vengeance Can Wait that was produced here in 2008. And again, a different way of thinking, a great way to collaborate with co-translators and learn from them in that case. And then I think I had a chance to work, thanks to Andrea Tome and the Lark, on the US-Mexico word exchange, and translated 3 plays. A writer named Alberto Villarreal Diaz, who'd written a wonderful play called Events with Life's Leftovers that he took very much inspiration from Roland Schimmelpfennig and a number of German writers. And for me, Alberto's way, learning Alberto's work, anything Alberto's work was my way into all of these wonderful German writers too. I don't read German, but I felt, because I spent some time in Mexico with Alberto and some other writers down there, Veronica Bujero as well. And also had a chance to go up to Montreal, to Quebec for French translation at one point. So getting out of the US sort of dramaturgical mindset and hearing the conversation that was going on for these other artists in these other countries, that was really valuable too, I think, to see we can be pretty parochial here in a lot of ways. We don't always see outside. our own borders in terms of our writing. A lot of people do. I should not say that. A lot of companies do. I mean, the Play Company, for example, is really very good at this, and a lot of other artists and writers do it. But for me, I think it was really great to broaden my horizons of what a play can be. And I think all of my engagements with work from outside the US or from the Anglophone world have taught me a great deal as a writer. And how that manifests, you can't always say, but that I feel like is the gift of that connection, which is both sort of literal with other writers, and seeing their work and knowing their work, but also sort of on an intellectual level to read and feel and to know what's possible with a piece of text and theater, and allowing one to sort of not. I think the work that we have to do sometimes is not to take anything for granted. And there's so many things that so many grooves we fall into. Take, this is what we think this is what a play must do, but to learn ways to realize, oh, these are certain assumptions that are made. How do we get out of that? And I think translation for me has given me some insight into that and some opportunities to do that where I might not have as much otherwise.
Yeah, no, I hear you. And it makes me think about how those assumptions get so ingrained that sometimes kind of self-censorship occurs from the writer's perspective, where you go, no, that couldn't possibly be a play, because that's not the rule that what a play, like that the kind of formation of what a play should be, whether that's how it's taught pedagogically, in a university setting or not in a university setting, the aspiration around what a play is. I made a joke, sort of a joke, the other day online, about when is the Pulitzer Prize for Drama going to recognize post-dramatic theater, and because it's totally a form of drama, and it feels like what tends to get elevated, with no disrespect to that kind of work, is that it continually falls within a certain grain of the expected dramatic, right? The expected a drama has the character and the setting and the this and the like, and it's like, but look at the world, like there's all kinds of drama being made all over the world, so, and I think this question of like being exposed to outside of the Anglophone tradition, and even within the Anglophone tradition, which is quite varied, but sometimes gets pigeonholed in a very narrow way, that there are other forms of making. And then, in fact, people think of theater and plays even not in the way that we think about them in the U.S. You know what I mean? Like, a play can be, a collage, or it can be an assembly of objects, or it can be, like, and I just think that that's such a liberating. We're so, it's a conundrum here, I think, because, I'm a playwright, you're a playwright, we love words, we love words, we love language, but that it's not all that. Right, that it's not all language. Like, it actually, a play is this other thing. It's an event in space, whether that space is digital or whether it's in person, right? So honoring that, really what you're dealing with is space and time. You're doing sort of time-based work in space, or different spaces, or hybrid spaces, and sometimes you're using language. And so I guess that's a definition that I think doesn't get as forefronted as much. And I think when I'm engaging myself as a translator, when I'm reading other work that's not essentially from the US, again, a very narrow tradition of US drama, it's so like, oh, right, remember, that's what a play can be, so I think this idea of the possible gets opened up when you're in the realm of just, I think about like Tina Howe, whom you mentioned, the late Tina Howe, the great Tina Howe. I was talking to Christian Parker about Tina's work. Christian Parker, wonderful dramaturg, and who also directed some of her plays. And he said, Tina loved Ionesco. Like, Ionesco was her like hero, right? And it's like, well, if we didn't have Ionesco in translation, that would have not happened. Do you know what I mean? Like the idea of being able to have contact with another form, way of thinking, another artist way of thinking about drama, liberated how Tina was thinking about drama, right? So I think that that's one example of many, but I feel like it's so necessary. And one of the things that I worry about so much in the U.S. is that, for many reasons, uh, geopolitics and a lot of what's happening in the country at the moment and potentially in the future, is a narrowing of borders, an
Yes.
increasing narrowness, an increasing kind of like structures, or like it can only be this, don't go that far, don't go out, don't step across that line, which impacts how we think and make. There's a, I'm gonna, oh my gosh, am I going to quote him? I think I'm going to quote him just for a second. So David Hare, I know he gets maligned a great deal. David Hare has this wonderful quote that I love, which is, think outward, not inward, when you're a playwright. That your view should be this way, that it should be outward toward the world. What you do with that then is up to you as an artist. But I think that actually that step creates a different kind of engagement with the kind of theater you want to make. So I just throw that out there. I don't know if you have any responses to the 1,001 things that I just said, but I open the floor to you, Andy.
Yeah, no, I think there are a few things that really land for me there. And just briefly on Tina Howe, there was a memorial service at Hunter for her last Monday, and my wife Crystal Finn and I were privileged enough to get to share a little something. We were very close with Tina for a long time, and we read, or she mostly read. I sort of set up the fireman monologue from Tina's translation of The Bald Soprano, it's so alive and so joyous. And yes, Ionesco was so central to her thinking, along with the Marx Brothers, and the sense of mayhem and all of that. Yeah, I think it's looking outward in various different ways is great. I read a lot of fiction, a lot of foreign fiction as well, and I find that is a good way to think about it. I mean, the other thing is I think a lot of the questions you raise relate to how I make theater, at least, or how I try to make theater. I mean, looking at, for example, a lot of these people whose work I translated have their own companies. For example, Villarreal was making his own work. Yukio Matoya in Japan had her own company. And that's how they did it. The US, the model which I came up in, not that it particularly worked well for me, where you would mail a hard copy of a play to a theater and then wait for a nice letter back it's certainly dead right now, but even the version of emailing something or through an agent doesn't feel particularly functional in the big picture. So I've taken inspiration for what does it mean to be making, how do I find a way to make theater? How do I find a way to open my brain to different ways of working, as opposed to just being the writer who sends his work and hopes that he is chosen? This is something that Emily Morrison, the dramatist, talks about. Are you waiting to be selected or chosen, or are you finding a way, your own way forward, whatever that is? And I think that the international writers, certainly in Mexico City, I'm close with Ana Graham and Antonio Vega, who of Por Piedad, who work both in Mexico City and New York City, and they've really made choices, amazing aesthetic choices, and worked through grants, through support, and they've worked in both countries. And I have such admiration for what they've built and the life they've built as artists, as creators. And so I look around at models like that, and I mean, there are models in the US too. There's certainly artists who do this very, very well, ranging from Julia Jarco to many others, and I admire it. And I continue to think about, well, what is a satisfying life and career to make art in this field and to engage outwardly with the community and on a literary level and a theatrical level. And so that's always a question for me.
Yeah, I hear you. Yes, indeed. A slight sidebar related, if you wish to say. you've mentioned some wonderful artists, and I just wonder if there are folks like who's on your table right now? Who are you reading? Like what's kind of like you look at your wonderful horizon of your writing table and like these are the three things that are like firing up my brain right now.
Um, I mean, what am I reading? I
Or
mean,
watching. It could be like, cinematic or music or
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. I've been really distracting myself with some mysteries. I read the entire Chester Himes of recently, which was wonderful. I just read this book by Esau Macaulay about growing up, something in the Promised Land. I'm forgetting what it's called right now. About growing up Black in the South. I was very interested in that. I've been thinking some about Mississippi lately. I want to go back to Tennessee Williams, having just been down in Mississippi and spending some time in Clarksdale, where he spent a lot of time, where Karen Kohlhaas has opened a little museum and is doing a documentary on his time there. In terms of playwrights, I mean, there's so many interesting writers. One writer whose work I've really come to love recently is Angela Hanks. Club Thumb did Bodies They Ritual, the summer before last and Summer Works, and I really loved that play. And I've gotten to know her a little bit. I'm not well. She visited a class of mine last fall or spring, but it was so strange and uncompromising and lovely. So I mean, her work I think is really exciting to me. I don't know. There's so many
Absolutely.
wonderful people out there.
Totally. No, it's sort of fun to, this is sometimes a question when I work with a dramaturg, on a specific project, and they'll be like, "What were you reading when you were writing
Mm,
that play?" Right?
yeah,
Because it does become, whether it's directly related or not, it does become part of the atmosphere that surrounds the making of that work.
yeah,
So whether it's, sometimes it's uh, not like research, sometimes it's just like, oh, and I happened to pick up, like you said, the mystery thing, and I was reading, but somehow I think that seeps into your consciousness in terms of what you end up making, um, uh, kind of surreptitiously. So it's sort of fun to sort of see what's on your writing table. I wanted to shift, and this is slightly related again, to the very dire question about finances and being an artist and so forth, but the very precarious place that I think, and certainly the change that has happened, certainly since the 70s, but in the New York downtown theater scene into, spaces that are no longer, for example, the spaces that have shuttered, a climate of around the whole country around forced austerity, and how that's affected the making of, or the financing of, the dreaming of, and the actualization of, um, shall we call, experimental theater work. And so, and you've grown up in the city, this is your hometown. Like, I just wonder what you've seen, like what you've gleaned, and like, what thoughts and wisdom you may have for us.
yeah. I wish I had more wisdom. I would say this, that I mean, it's really hard to do a play right now, and there are a lot of factors. I mean, one is getting space, free space. There aren't that many spaces to just put something up very often. I mean, there is always the kind of fantasy of whatever it was with Cafe Chino and Mabu Mines, and I don't know enough about that world to say. I'm sure there were some challenges and frustrations in that world as well. I do think right now and I've been thinking about this a lot, and I'm thinking about doing another play either next season or the season after, and trying to figure out how. And that has to do with space, B, with paying people fairly, even on a showcase code. So financing the combination of grants, fundraising, and ticket sales. And I even think that the first production I did under my own company of this play, Don't You Fucking Say a Word, at 59, we were on a contract at that point. So we had a pretty substantial budget. We ran 28 shows, and I was able to pull it off. Firstly, because 509059 has a very good and loyal subscription audience. Secondly, I got a piece in the New York Times about it at a time when that was about tennis and it was drawing audience. So a lot of things came together, and I feel very lucky to be able to do that. And then the second production of my company of notes, I was going to do it on a smaller scale until the play company came aboard. I mean, the lesson may be a little bit of, if you build it, they will come. You have to be prepared to make something. And then sometimes, not always, you can get some partnerships. And I think that because I have a bit of a track record right now, I am having a little bit better luck with grants than I did in the past, because I've made some work now in this form. And yet I'm trying to think about, and I take my time with this when the play I'd like to do is To the Playground, this play I mentioned at the beginning. And I'm really trying to think through, well, where do I do it? What's the best way to show this play? What is financially possible? Where does an audience come from? So really asking a lot of hard questions and being okay with the answers. Oh, I see, I can't do this right now. I don't have the resources. I mean, in the bigger picture, it's really hard. I think I don't know how younger artists always find a way. They're making work in Brooklyn and Queens. They're building stuff in their own community. And so people do find a way. There is a kind of muddled, mucky middle of artists that a lot of us are in, where you're not getting massive institutional support to see your work put on, and yet you're not a beginning emerging artist who's going to be building certain things. And that mucky middle can be tricky, and trying to find a way to make work with that. And I don't know if that was different 30, 40 years ago. It may have been. There may have been more opportunities. I think we're in a moment where we have less audience. The audience is shrinking and aging. We have to find some new audiences. The institutions are struggling, so they are both narrowing what they have the capacity to do and are willing to do, and also have less ability to offer the little extras to help the independent people do stuff. So they're probably less anxious to do a favor or whatever it is. I mean, that's not true. There's some really generous people in the industry, and I go back and forth on it. It can feel hopeless and pointless, and can also feel deeply energizing. And I know a lot of people who find ways to do exciting things on all scales. So again, I always lean on the optimist side, I guess, in terms of that constitutionally, that may be where I come down. Yeah. So I like to believe that despite some of the real urban challenges here, it's possible. I mean, I guess I've made a life in the field somehow, some way, and there are a lot of factors. Part of it is there are a lot of factors like good union contracts at the two places I adjunct, Barnard and Tisch, good middle-income housing from a 1950s program. I'm in a Mitchell Lama. So, I mean, I have been helped by some very specific systems. I am lucky and grateful for that. And that is, though some of those things are hard to get. So I feel a lot has gone, I mean, not much effort, but a lot has gone my way in that regard, and it's not always available. But for me, building a career in life in this field has involved trying to make choices that enable me to do this somehow without being utterly consumed and exhausted by survival. And I've worked hard to make that possible.
Yeah, no, I hear you. And I think that the question of survival, there was what is this? I saw somebody this morning was writing a line about, it was kind of like a joke, but kind of not, where they said, if you want to take care of your mental health, don't go into the theater. But it was pointing to this question of like it's not only that it's a precarious industry to begin with, but that literally thinking about survival every single second is a cost on your mental health, on your well-being, but also the art that you make, right? Because if your brain is occupied 90%, 95% of the time with how am I going to, where's the next check going to come, all of that. And then at the same time, you're supposed to be, I'm an open receptor to the magic of the world. And I'm trying to write it down as a playwright. It's like you can't. Do you know what I mean? Because your brain is like, well, how do I, And so I think that I often think like the fact that, unless you have, are wealthy, independently wealthy or something, like, I think it's a miracle that anybody makes anything. Do you know what I mean? Because it's like literally, it feels like we're in a country with no art subsidy. So it feels like it's literally impossible. It's stacked against you right from the get-go. And I think in a city like this one, like New York, which is exorbitant.
Yes.
Do you know what I mean? I mean, artists are being priced out of the city, So I think that some of the perhaps glamour or imagined glamour about that particular era of downtown theater also had to do with that the rents were cheaper, literally. Do you know what I mean? Like people could like squat somewhere, like do the thing, and then hang out and like make the work, and and of course that still happens, but it's not as easy to do that anymore, because a lot of that kind of like housing has also fallen by the wayside. It's now, a friend of mine was like, oh my gosh, they didn't know what Losida meant. They were like, Lower East Side, and I was like, it's totally a thing. It was totally a thing once, and Losida was like a whole like and that's where the Euricans hung out and like Dominicans hang out, like, and there's vestiges of that community still there, but Losida has changed. Losida has become very bougie and very gentrified, and like a studio costs $4,000 to rent. It's like that prices you out of Losida, right? Like you can't live there. So I just think about like how even the sort of glamorous era of thinking about the work that was thriving that then created La Mama and then created all these places that we sort of know and love, that atmosphere is gone. That's not even possible anymore. So I guess it's just something I keep rattling my brain around, like I feel like art centers away from New York thrive in different ways because the costs are cheaper, but also in some ways there's less opportunities to be seen. Do you know what I mean? Like, what am I making for? Like, it's great that you're making it for your friends, but it's like, but is anybody seeing it? Like, hello, right? So, and I get that a lot when I speak to folks that are working, like in Omaha, for example. There's a wonderful art scene, but like they feel like nobody's looking at what we're doing. Like, I don't know, how do I get the work out of Omaha? How do I sort of move it forward? And New York still carries this prestige, right? As sort of the imprimatur of being a New York artist or having the work done here. So it's just something I'm rattling around in my brain. I always like to end with, perhaps not wisdom, since that's a scary word, but advice you may have for artists coming up, or just folks interested in playwriting, and yeah, just advice, lessons, love, any of the above.
Yeah, I mean, I guess talking to some students and talking to a couple people recently, I mean, the main one I think is it's okay to not know what you're doing for a very long time as a writer. Be kind to yourself, try not to judge what you're doing, and get to an end and then figure out what something is. I mean, maybe that's not, every brain is different. Some people like to outline and figure stuff out. But I think whatever it is, to give yourself permission to exist in the uncertainty of something for as long as you can as a writer, and give yourself space to sort of take some paths that don't feel, instead of saying, I have to know what this is, I have to have the right choice, and if I don't, then it's not successful. Just give oneself space to discover. I mean, you, to a very great extent, me to some extent, studied with Fornes, and I think that her intuitive approach to writing and to life and to art in general, and her huge openness is where the greatness lay, and that she had And it is a kind of inner confidence. She had a deep inner confidence to know, to be okay not knowing what something was, or not knowing exactly what she was doing, and okay, this feels alive to me. And maybe if we can get to a point where something feels alive, as opposed to this is my perfect product or my jewel or something, I think the ethos, and we may not have the real estate for it right now, but I do think that the ethos of that generation, I look at those, I so love that generation. It's very sad to see, be it Fornes, be it Albee, Shepard, Guare, Howe, all this generation. And I think Guare is the only writer still alive. But all of the Cafe Chino, and there are so many others, Julie Bavasso, all these other writers, but there's such a life and freedom in the spirit of that work. Even the work I don't like, it has that life and freedom to it. And how do we find that ethos as writers in a very different, in some ways more buttoned down world? I think that's where I would go.
Yes, I love this. What a beautiful way to end this conversation. Find a life in the work, find a life, and be inspired by people that could spot that. You know what I mean? Could hold on to that and not let it get away from them. For those of you that are watching, thanks for watching. If you want to rewatch, we'll be here on the YouTube channel for you at any time. And check out more conversations from the Alcove. Follow the series. It will be building and developing as we go. Thank you again to Andy Bragen for being our guest today. See you on the other side. I'm going to hit end record, but I will stay online with Andy just for a minute to say so long. Bye for now on the official end.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.